the number of people who would normally vote in federal or state elections, or who sometimes vote in federal or state elections? About 3/4 more? Okay, thanks. Just interesting. On to go?
Yep.
This session here is not intended to pour cold water on the recognition debate that we had in the other room. Sarah thought that if you're going to get the community together to have an information session about the good, the fors and against of the constitutional recognition, you should take advantage of it and have another session about some of our other issues, the bigger issues. So while we're talking about a treaty and the separate state, it's not, the plan isn't sort of to close your mind off against recognition. You know, people are for it, good. Against it, good. It's a separate issue. On the question of a treaty or the separate state, for a number of years now, since the early 1980s, or it might have been the late 1970s, Nugget Coombs and Stuart Harris, who wrote It's Coming Yet, where Nugget Coombs was the ex-governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, so a very prominent man in Australia. And he'd been around Aboriginal communities all around the country, and he believed that unless Australia signed a treaty with Aboriginal people, then you can have land rights, service delivery, you can set up jobs in the public service or whatever. But there was something fundamentally lacking, because he believed that when you look at the circumstances of Aboriginal people, that is, that we owned the whole of this continent before it was invaded. Then a new people come in and they take over all our rights and then say to us, you can now blend into our society. No rules, no consultation, you just do it the way we want you to do it. And Nugget Coombs pointed out that that's entirely different in Australia from the way it was done elsewhere. Like in New Zealand, as Pat Turner mentioned, the Treaty of Waitangi laid down the relationship between the Maori and the Pakeha, which was the white people who came in and set up New Zealand. And as we all know, the American Indians signed treaties in North America and the United States with the United States government and the Canadian government. And although those treaties, don't solve all the problems, they at least establish a relationship, a political relationship between the federal governments and the Indians. Whereas in Australia, in the absence of a treaty, we are treated as mere citizens of Australia who have a right to lobby for our rights. But we've got no special standing. As the American Indians can sue the United States government or the Canadian government as Indians, because they've got recognition in their treaties. As the people, we cannot sue the Australian government in the name of Aboriginal people because we have no legal status. As individuals we can sue for our rights, but not as a people, because of no law in the country that says Aboriginal people have this right. And even if the constitutional recognition goes through, it will not give us a right to sue. Another thing I didn't mention in there, but we've got the general drift of it. So, Kevin Gilbert was an Aboriginal poet and writer, and he took up the task in 1987 of writing up, of the books in there somewhere, writing up Treaty 88. And he was the first Aboriginal person that I know of who wrote up what could be in this treaty. And the point that he was making was that Australia can't just come, the white people just can't come into the country and say, we've taken over. and therefore Aborigines have got no rights other than the rights that we give them. He said, what about Aboriginal sovereignty? Aboriginal people were a sovereign people before the whites came here, which means we had absolute control over the continent, and even though other people could come in, they all, like the Indonesians came down to the top end of the Northern Territory, the Chinese came into the top end of Western Australia, but they all knew that the continent belonged to Aboriginal people until the British arrived. And Kevin Gilbert makes the point that if we were a sovereign people in 1788, because we had exclusive rights over this country, as against the British, the Europeans, the Americans, anyone else, even though another group has come in and taken over our country, doesn't mean we lose our rights. It simply means we can't exercise the rights. And there's a big difference between not being able to exercise your rights as the real owners, the original people, the people who've got sovereignty, on the one hand, as against not having the right. Because otherwise, when Germany invaded France, Poland in the Second World War, those countries didn't lose their sovereignty, they lost their ability to exercise their rights of sovereignty. And the same thing applies to us. So Kevin Gilbert says sovereignty must be addressed in the Constitution, in the treaty, bloody Constitution. Now, what he didn't say was how that could be expressed in a treaty. But his view was, you start off with the Australian government as a sovereign nation that's recognised overseas, but inside Australia there's an Aboriginal nation that's a sovereign people, and therefore the treaty then works out the detail of how these two sovereign peoples share up the country. So that was his point about sovereignty. He also said that there's got to be a land settlement, which means that 40% of the Australian landmass, he suggested, which is about 3 million square kilometres of land out of, I think, 7.5 million square kilometres or something. He said 40% of that should be handed back to Aboriginal people without having to go through tribunals. The treaty should simply say all the Crown lands in Australia are handed back to Aboriginal people. A bit like the Tasmanian land rights legislation does. It says all of the Crown land on Cape Barren is now handed back to the Aboriginal community. Risdon Cove is now handed back to Aboriginal people. Just a simple piece of legislation. And the treaty would do that. He also said that you can't just have a relationship between Aborigines and the Commonwealth and have land handed back to Aboriginal people. He said, where's the money for Aboriginal people to run their own services, do things in their own communities, without having to go cap in hand to a government department every year, like we do at the moment, begging for this bit of cash, begging for that. And he always argued that 7% of the gross domestic product of Australia should be set aside as compensation for the 200 years that they've used our land, where they've raised trillions of dollars. The current gross domestic product in 2014 is $1.5 trillion. Where's Chris? Where are you, Mansell? Where is it? What's 7% of 1.5 trillion? I think it works out to, according to my calculations, about 100 billion or something around that figure. Okay. So, which is interesting. Now, Kevin Gilbert wrote that in 1987, which is nearly 30 years old, Treaty 88. And it's interesting that this debate about Aboriginal groups who have got land in the Northern Territory and in Cape York want to raise money off their land, and so they're now agreeing to mortgage their land in order to raise money. And everybody knows the minute you mortgage your money, you give up your rights to the land, to the bank or to the lender, and because, as we know, we're not real good business people, we can't always pay the land back, we lose the land again. And one of the arguments has been is that in recent times is there should be a $50 billion fund set aside for Aboriginal people so that you don't have to mortgage your land. We all apply into that central fund for money to buy Van Diemen's Land Company, dairy farm.
Here.
Yeah, fucking or, you know, whatever other projects are around. So instead of having to mortgage Cape Barren or Risdon Cove or Oyster Cove, you keep your land, you pull that money out and you try to build up investment on behalf of the Aboriginal community.
Isn't there already that Aboriginal benefit fund that comes out of the mining royalties that has over 1.4 billion a year? So, but you have to be a native title recipient to be able to access that.
Is this the Northern Territory?
This is Western Australia has it as well, Northern Territory. So there is already precedent set of that occurring.
Only if you've got native title.
Yes.
Or, and with native title you have a right to negotiate, but you don't have a right to the royalties. And usually what happens, a mining company says, well, we can hold out if we want to, and just say, we're going to give you nothing. But what they usually say, look, it's worth us just to throw a couple of million their way. And in the bottom end of West, like this forest that's going around, that billionaire miner, he did a deal in the southern part of Western Australia where the native title holders had a right to negotiate, and he just held out, and he said, he went to a second group, exactly what Pat was talking about there this morning, and offered them, I think, 5 million or something, and as a result of it, the federal government then cuts back their budget by 5 million, so they end up with nothing. So anyway, there are these arguments. Here in Tasmania, of course, we get nothing. We get neither native title nor any compensation under legislation. So a treaty could provide, particularly for those Aboriginal groups who've got nothing now and no land base, could get a compensation fund. Another possibility under the treaty proposal is this thing that Clyde's cousin came up with, Jackie Lambie. She's not related to she stood up and said, well, Aborigines should have designated seats in the Parliament. And the idea is that, which is part of the reason why I asked how many of you vote. Under the current Australian voting system, like here in Tasmania, there are 5 electorates, I think, Bass, Braddon, Franklin and so on. And most people would say there's 14,000 Aborigines, but the census now says we are 24,000. And according to the census figures, the Aboriginal population in Tasmania is the second highest proportionately in the country, behind only the Northern Territory.
Oh, what?
We are proportionally more Aborigines than South Australia, more than New South Wales, more than Queensland, according to the census figures. So, we'll leave that aside for the moment, but in terms of getting Aborigines, if people say you need to get Aborigines into the Parliament to have a say, and a lot of people say, well, hang on, what does that achieve? But that just debate aside for the moment. If there's, say, 20,000 Aborigines, and we spread around the state, and in each of those electorates, I think there might be 40,000 voters or something, and we are 4,000 each electorate, what's the chances of Aborigines being able to vote to get our delegate up in one of those elections? It's just, you know, it just doesn't happen. And history shows it can't happen, which makes me wonder, why do you vote?
Cousin got 0.01%.
What's that?
Clyde's cousin got 0.01%. You got it.
Yeah.
On preferences.
Clyde probably helped her.
The silent voter. And so the designated seats is an alternative to this pretty hopeless situation. In the United States, when the blacks couldn't get anyone into their Congress, their federal parliament, they passed a law called the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what they said was, where you get distinct, a cohesive black area, then you don't dump them like you do with Aborigines among a larger white area so that they're always a minority. You separate that off and at least give the blacks a 50% chance. Now with the numbers they've got in the United States, they can do that. And that's why you see a lot of black politicians over there. In New Zealand, of course, they said, well, we want to have designated seats. And so that's part of the Treaty of Waitangi. Here in Australia, you can have designated seats either in the Tasmanian Parliament or the federal Parliament. One man, and there are constitutional problems with this, but one man said, to get around the constitutional problems, you combine the Northern Territory with Western Australia, Queensland and New South Wales, and I think West Australia, South Australia and Victoria and Tasmania combined, so you get 4 Aboriginal elected people, where Aborigines in those areas select their delegate. Now, ignoring the census figures, the Victorians would say, well look, we're going to vote for an Aboriginal that we're familiar with, and Tasmanians would vote for someone they're familiar with. So Victoria's likely to get the delegate up, West Australia is the bigger number, they'll get their delegate up, Northern Territory would get their delegate up, so half of the Aboriginal population is not going to be represented. When I looked at it, it doesn't mean that I support designated seats just because I look at it and I say there's options, because I have serious reservations about it. John R. Kitt was an Aboriginal member of the Legislative Assembly in the Northern Territory, and when he was there he said designated seats are a form of political assimilation. So keep that in mind. But if people wanted to pursue designated seats, one way that is constitutionally possible is for the federal government simply to pass a law under the race power, because it's got the power to do it, to say in those states and territories where there are large Aboriginal populations, they will have 2 delegates each. South Australia, West Australia, Northern Territory, Queensland and New South Wales. I think that makes 10. Then in Victoria they will have 1. In Tasmania we would have 1. So that makes 12. Then you give 1 to the Torres Strait Islanders to have their own delegate. Because even though there's been 28 Aboriginal politicians elected in Australia at the federal and state level, since Neville Bonner went there in 1973, not one of them has been a Torres Strait Islander. Okay, so we talk about our problems, the Islanders got their problems too. So that would give 13 elected people, and here in Tasmania you would either be like the ATSIC roll, you either vote in the general elections or you vote in the Aboriginal election.
Can I ask, would that be in the Senate or the lower house?
Well, that was my next point. I'm glad you raised that, because the other bloke I was talking about, John Chesterman, who nominated 4, he reckons they should be in the lower house where the government initiates legislation. I think, because there's 150 delegates already there, to have 4 there, you can have 4.
Jackie's reading.
Tell it to sell on a rising market. There's 76 senators, and with the 13 added to it, that would make it 89. And if 13 Aboriginal and Islander politicians were in the Senate, it'd give you a lot more political power than you would 4 people, or 13 out of 163 in the lower house. So if you're going to do it, you're better off doing it in the upper house. So I know it's brief and I've jumped over a lot of things, but that's essentially what a treaty is about. Can Australia sign a treaty with Aboriginal people? Of course it can. John Howard said a nation can't sign a treaty with itself, but he just didn't want to sign a treaty. Not that he couldn't, he didn't want to. Under the race powers, the Australian government can pass a law with anything to do with Aboriginal people. It can pass laws to punish us. It can pass laws to take away all the land rights that we've got here in Tasmania. They would have to compensate us, but they can pass any law, good or bad, over Aboriginal people. And so they've got the power to do it. How would they do a treaty? Well, they would have to legislate. Because if, say, the father of reconciliation, Pat Dodson, walked into the Parliament today and had meetings with all of us, and we said, yeah, Pat, you go in and here's the deal. We've signed all these things. And he goes in and he and Tony Abbott signs a document. There it is there. There's the Aboriginal Treaty. You'd come outside, Prime Minister's signature on it, Pat Dodson's signature on it. It's worth nothing. You can't sue on it. Remember I said that we have got no legal standing as Aboriginal people. It's not a law. It's just a document, a letter signed by the head of the country. But just as the head of the country gave an apology in 2007 to the stolen generations, you couldn't sue on that. So the only way you can sue on these things is for legislation to say, here are the rights that Aborigines have under a treaty, and if we don't deliver, they can sue. And that gives Aboriginal people standing to sue.
What would they put that in there though?
Well, it's got to have an enforcement provision.
Right.
Yeah. But you can't just sign a treaty that doesn't have legislation. The danger with that, of course, is how secure is that if one Parliament passed it this year, 10 years later you get a different lot come in and they can say, we're going to wipe it. And there's nothing you can do. Beth?
Is that in Canada, because I didn't realise that they needed to have that enforcement provision, but in the Canadian Constitution, when they reached the treaty in the 80s, then they put that in their Constitution that all the rights afforded to the Indigenous people of Canada would be recognised in that treaty. So does that then lock in that enforcement right for them? Because was that in
See, up until they put that in the Constitution, the Canadian courts had already recognised the validity of treaties, and they also recognised native title way back in the 1800s. So there was this real bundle of rights that the Canadian Indians already had. So when they passed the constitutional provision that said all those rights that exist continue to exist, the Constitution was saying no one can interfere with it. But here in Australia, what rights have we got?
No.
So if you put in the Constitution that all those rights that Aborigines have got cannot be interfered with, what rights are you talking about? The right to do everything else that white people do. We've got no special rights. So this treaty is trying to catch up with what the American Indians, North and South, did, and New Zealand did, 150 years ago. All happy? Okay.
So how are we going to start this process then?
Right, do you want to move on to Seventh State, or do you want to talk a bit about the treaty?
We go to the seventh state, then we can find it all.
I think
Yeah.
Anthony wanted to say.
I was just interested with one of Pat's comments in relation to being able to negotiate a treaty at a local government level. I didn't realise that was possible. In terms of embracing an incremental approach, is it worthwhile exploring in Tasmania with 29 local government areas, whether there be a council that is interested in going down that path?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. And what her comment opened up was, what do you mean by a treaty? Like, a treaty is normally reserved between a national government and another national government overseas, or a distinct people who have been overrun. A local council operates under a piece of local government legislation. They can't speak on behalf of the Tasmanian government or the Commonwealth government. And so what you're doing is bringing down the status of Aboriginal people to the local government level. So it doesn't mean that clearly can be done, you know, like schools. Like I've heard people argue on the mainland that, well, you can have a treaty with the schools. You know, what do you mean? And they say, oh, well, you know, they raise the flag and they stand up and say, we acknowledge the traditional owners. That's a treaty. Well, if that's a treaty, anything can be a treaty. You know, so what people are talking, what Kevin Gilbert and other people are talking about is saying, look, forget all that. You can go off and do those little day-to-day things if you want to, but don't call them a treaty, because they're not a treaty. A treaty is a document that's binding on the Australian people, that Aboriginal people, by and large, agree with, and which gives Aboriginal people fundamental rights that we all say, yes, we can live with that.
Tasmanian Aborigines would be better off making a treaty with the Tasmanian government that says we'll give you this amount of your land back and we'll give you this much money and your own schools, rather than how we benefit from all Aborigines getting something from federal parliament.
It can be done. Then the question is it a treaty or is it honouring an agreement that was made with Aboriginal people who've taken over Flinders when they said, we gave up our land on the promise that we'd be returned. Is it a treaty or is it honouring that agreement?
Does the word treaty kind of say that once we've agreed to it, that's it, you can't ask for more? Where if it wasn't a treaty, we're just asking for more.
And it's the implications of that approach at the local level. Like, if a treaty is likely to be made at that sort of state or territory level, which group of Aborigines are more likely to agree with about a treaty out of anywhere in the country? Tasmania? No. Northern Territory. So the moment that you get one Aboriginal state breaking away from the national campaign, and you get a campaign up and running to say we want it here in Tasmania, the federal government will go to the Northern Territory and say we'll make a treaty with Northern Territory Aborigines. And then you can't blame the Northern Territory Aborigines for saying, look, we want to stick with you all, but crikey, you know, they've given us all this back, they've allowed us to set up our own government, we're in control of our own culture and education, so, you know, sorry guys, you know, we have to grab them. So it's united we stand, divided we fall, is the argument. But then again, there's a big move on the mainland for, you know, look, Anthony was saying about local councils. I know in Victoria they're talking about treaties with local councils. And elsewhere they're talking about each traditional area group, instead of being part of the Aboriginal nation, they are a nation unto themselves, and therefore they will go off and make a treaty with the New South Wales government and so on. So, you know, that's the debate.
When Pat was saying that if there was constitutional recognition, that it wouldn't cancel out, I suppose, the standing to be able to negotiate a treaty. I didn't understand how that could possibly be.
Because what they're saying is, let's suppose the referendum gets up, whatever it is, and then Aborigines are somehow recognised in the Constitution. The next day we go and say, we want a treaty, we want our sovereign rights, or we want a seventh state. They might say politically, oh no, we gave you recognition. You say, yeah, but that doesn't interfere with our sovereign rights. They didn't mention sovereignty. No mention of self-determination. No mention of a seventh state. No mention of land rights. And if they were being logical, they'd say, yeah, well, that's right. We're now here to talk to you about these big issues. Okay, let's talk. So that's what she means. She's right. It doesn't cancel, one thing doesn't cancel out all the others. You don't lose your rights just because the government says we'll give you this rather than that. Okay, seventh state. You right, Sarah?
You're right.
When the whitefellas set up the Australian Constitution in 1901, the only reference to us was to say Aborigines shall not be counted as Australian citizens, and nor were we allowed to vote. That was the Australian Constitution. But what they did say was, look, the founding forefathers of white Australia. Gillian! You awake? Drifting off there a bit. Yeah. She was dozing off there a bit. Come right. I'm sorry, Jill. What they said was, all right, there are 6 states and a federal government. But they said, look, we don't know what's going to happen in Australia in the future. There's almost certainly been more than 6 states. So you've got to put provisions in there to allow for new states to come into Australia. Now what they were thinking about at that stage was New Zealand joining Australia, and at that stage New Zealand said, piss off, you know, we're our own country. But they said, what if New Zealand changed its mind? So they put section 121, the Commonwealth Government can admit New Zealand or establish a new state by passing legislation. And they're also talking about New Guinea and Fiji. And it was thought then that these new states would come in. And they also thought, well, maybe it's not going to be a new state from outside of the Australian boundaries, it could be for inside. Because they thought, at that stage, South Australia owned the whole of the Northern Territory. And it was thought in 1899, well look, it's such a huge area. Is South Australia always going to be in control of the Northern Territory? And so they said, no, we must allow the Commonwealth Government to establish a state there later on if they want to. The reason they didn't make it a state at that time was because of full of blackfellas. And they were waiting for white people to go up and migrate there to become the population, so that they thought, well, it'll eventually become another state. So they planned in the Constitution for countries outside of Australia to be admitted. The word admit is used to describe an existing country. But they also said establish, because if the Northern Territory was going to become a new state, you're not admitting it because it doesn't exist as a country. You're establishing it. And so they said, oh, how does this work? So they said, under section 122, we give the federal parliament the power to pass a law to say the Northern Territory is now a new state of Australia. That's all it has to say, simple as that. And they pass it through to Parliament and the Northern Territory is a new state. So the question is, if there was a treaty and you wanted to bring together all the rights that Aboriginal people might want, and then once you get them in there, the best you can get, how can you protect it against a later Parliament changing its mind and rescinding the law? You know, as when I was talking to Ruth there, that they passed legislation to make a treaty, and then 10 years later, they passed a law to undo the treaty. Well, under the Constitution, can you get up our constitutional provisions there, please, Sarah? Hurry up, Sarah.
Is this one?
Constitution of Australia.
Just checking.
Now, you'll just see here, I mean, this is not technical. I'm just showing that it, you know, to prove that it exists. That's not it, that's it. Go down to section 121, Sarah Maynard. See, new states may be admitted or established. The Parliament, it's the federal Parliament, not the state. The federal Parliament may admit or establish new states. Now, the High Court has said, once the federal government uses that power to establish, pass legislation to establish a state, its power is then spent. In other words, if the Parliament passes a treaty law, it can go back later and undo the treaty law. But under this one, once it establishes a state, it can't undo the state. So when I looked at this, I thought, oh, this is interesting. Where are you? No, back this way. section, where's 111? There it is. States may surrender territory. Now, if you go back to that map, Sarah, hurry up.
Sarah?
There. Now, this map has been done by Professor John Altman and someone Markham. They've mapped Australia and they said if you take account, can you see? If you take account of all the land in Australia that Aboriginal people legally have rights over, land rights legislation, including the land rights here in Tasmania, land that has been purchased by the ILC, or native title land, whether it's exclusive possession or non-exclusive possession, where would those lands be? And they say that's the areas of land that's native title and land rights legislation. That amounts to 2.3 million square kilometres of land, which is 31% of the Australian land mass.
How come we don't colour in Tasmania?
What's that?
How come Tasmania doesn't have any?
Ask the Land Council.
We've got land rights legislation.
It's really small.
Yeah, it's on the island.
Can you go now to Mari, Pat and Clyde? This is almost an answer to Nala's question. In 1992, Nola, you was there. Who else was there? Karen was there. Where was it?
Up at the hotel in...
Yep.
Whatever street.
Back in the days when we were not afraid to take risks, we brought black bottles from all around the country, including our own elders here and the community here. We had a big meeting up in West Launceston there. What's that?
Is it the Great Northern?
I don't remember what the name of the place was. But when we brought it in, what's that? No, 1992. And what we did was we spoke to the Commissioner of Police and said, listen mate, had your lot not invaded our country, oh Michael, don't get click, I'm telling you. Had your lot not invaded this country, these people coming in here would be the government of the whole of this country. They would be in charge of this land and you people would have come in as immigrants and been a minority. So when these people come in the plane out to the Hobart Airport, you treat them with respect. He said, yep, no worries. So for those people who remember, the centre took cars out there with the Aboriginal flag on the front of it. So it was a convoy of these cars and we had 2 elders in each car and the police escorted them all the way through Hobart, had the lights flashing orange like they would with the Prime Minister. Even he doesn't get orange lights now, we did. And then as we're going along the big highway coming into Bellerive, a children's centre was on that overpass, the photos are still there. Welcome the APG. And when those old fellas from the mainland got there, they cried when they saw it. Never been treated like that in their lives. So, at that conference, this map here was created about the lands that we would say as a settlement that we were prepared to accept back. So whether people say, oh no, we're not stuck by that anymore, or whether we stand by it, there's the map.
Is that all Crown land?
It was, and of course since then we've got that land back, that land back. Oh well, you know, it's all swallowed up in some of that. So can we go back to the national map now? So you can see that this national map, hurry up, Sarah? Sarah! This map that I found off John Markham, I've held meetings on the mainland and of course they all freaked out, especially Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, same as Nala did, not much in Tasmania. What I said to them, this is not intended to be a map of the defined areas of the 7th Aboriginal state of Australia. what I'm producing it for is to show you how it could be. Like, each of those Aboriginal groups, for a start, would have to agree that their land is going to be included. Not all of them would. And a lot of other Aboriginal people say, well, listen, we've got no land, we want it to be included. And so we've got to have a lot of community meetings about that. And so, in terms of Tasmania, what land is it that the Aboriginal community here wants included in the seventh state, if it wants any included in the seventh state? So that's why I produced that Tasmanian map. What would the, and let me say this, people would say, you know, this is really pie in the sky, you've got, you know, this is really, you know, up there. Nelson Mandela was sitting in a prison in South Africa in 1960. If any of the guards had went in and said, Mr. President, and he'd said, what the hell are you talking about? You will be president the next 30 years, he'd laugh at him. But he was. Because he had a vision, his people had a vision, and they stuck to their guns. In other words, people can create anything if they're determined enough.
You want us to start calling you Nelson, you know, there?
Yeah.
And Archie
Like that.
Sauls,
And so, before you can run a campaign that would take 20 or 30 years to realise, you've got to know what it is you're fighting for. Go around the community here and say, let's have a march. How many are likely to get if you say that, as against? If they say, well, what are we marching for? And you tell them what the issue is. We're marching to save our site at Kutawana. We're marching for the land down here, or the government's trying to do this to a group of Aborigines in Hobart. That's what we march. You get, the numbers want to know what it is you're fighting for. And so the meetings we've been having around Australia so far, community meetings, nothing to do with government, is to say, what about the idea? Don't get stuck on these boundaries being the territory of the seventh state. Now, just on this question about what the boundaries would be, the greater the area of land that was to be handed back to Aboriginal people under a seventh state, the less likely you're going to get white support. The less likely the amount of land, the more likely you are to get support. So that's a matter for the communities. Each of the states, you don't need a referendum for this. Don't need referendums. You simply get a campaign and the federal government says we can now establish a state. They don't have to wait for the state governments to do anything. All of the states might unite and say, we are totally opposed to the Aboriginal state. And the federal government will say, we don't care. We are going to pass new legislation that says the Aboriginal state, or whatever it's called, some Aboriginal name, is now created. And they could say, because they've got the power over the Northern Territory and Canberra, in there somewhere, the ACT, the federal government has got unfettered powers to do anything in those territories. So they could say, well look, all this land in the Northern Territory and in the ACT is at least part of the seventh state. And it could then leave it open for each state to gradually hand land over to the seventh state by passing legislation. Like the Tasmanian government could pass an amendment to the Aboriginal Lands Act that says all the land under this Act is now surrendered to the seventh state. And that land would go into, be included in the seventh state. And the Tasmanian government, the other state, don't need a referendum. So that's the simplicity of it. What would the benefits to Aboriginal people be of something like this? It would have the power, the normal powers of a state government. We would have the powers to set up our own assembly. We could pass a law to say that all Aborigines in the country, regardless of where they live, if I live in Prospect and I'm not living on Aboriginal land, they could say all people like him can stand for election or vote in the elections. And that would give all Aboriginal people the opportunity to participate in it, even if you're not living on the land. It could pass a law to say that those Aborigines who are living on their land, that is part of the Northern Territory, part of the Seventh State, would have a whole bundle of certain rights over that territory that we might or might not be able to interfere with. That's a matter of discussion. You know, if an Aboriginal group, for example, has got 100 square kilometres of land and they discover oil on it, and it's their land, does our elected Aboriginal Assembly have the right to go in and take the oil away from them? Well, that's a matter of debate. It could pass a law to say we now recognise Aboriginal customary law in those communities where it exists. Now at the moment Australian law refuses to recognise Aboriginal customary law, and as a result of that, white police go in and arrest the elders who are trying to keep their young people in order under traditional law. Well, this would reverse that, and it would say, well, because we're a state government, we could do that. We would also have absolute control over education, health, housing, over roads, over rates, over any vacant lands, over planning and development, over royalties, raising our own taxes, and deciding which companies can come onto those lands and which couldn't. Enormous powers that we've never ever talked about before. They are all part of the Seventh State. Now, that's all the good stuff. It's not as simple as that, because if the Commonwealth Government, as an example of some of the problems, the Commonwealth Government could play silly buggers and say, can you go back to the Constitution, please, Sarah? Just as an example of how I'm trying to show you what could happen, but also how the government could muck us up in section 121. The federal parliament can establish a new state called the Aboriginal state, and may, upon such establishment, make or impose such terms and conditions as it thinks fit. So, you know, what does that mean? I know when the Northern Territory in 1998 almost became a state, John Howard supported them. And he used these powers here. He said, if a referendum is held amongst the Northern Territories and the majority agrees, we will pass legislation saying the Northern Territory is the seventh state. But he said, all the rights over what do you call it, bauxite and what's the uranium? And uranium remain in the federal government. All the environmental such and such, Kakadu National Park, all these rights, and Aboriginal land rights legislation remains under the Commonwealth. So in other words, what he was saying is we'll give all the powers back that a normal state would have, except these things here. And the Northern Territory wasn't happy, but they said, yeah, we can live with that. So you could expect that if we ran a campaign over a couple of decades, that it's almost certain that they would impose similar conditions. What they'd be, who knows? And we would have to make a decision, of course, whether the conditions, like Scotland. You know, Scotland had to decide in 1978, they pushed for independence and they had a referendum which lost. But they didn't give up. They kept going and said, we want independence, and in 1998 they had another referendum which lost again. But the United Kingdom Parliament could see the winds of change coming, so they said, look, we will pass a law to set up a Scottish Parliament that has all these powers, and they called them devolved powers. The federal government was given it to them and could take them away if they wanted to. So the Scots then from 1998 had their own parliament. But they said, we want independence. And as you know here a month ago, they had another referendum which they lost again. But again the United Kingdom has seen the winds of change and said, we want to hand over even more powers to the Scottish. So they're the sort of tactics that go on when you're running a big campaign that the Scots ran from 1978 to 2014, what's that, 26 years? 26 years or something like that. We have got to, if you're talking about this sort of stuff, you've got to stop running campaigns like the recognition one is during the life of this parliament. You've got to think, listen, we're going to plan this out over 10, 20, 30 years. And we've all got to make a contribution this way or another. And it's only that way that you can bring about change. Since the United Nations was set up in 1945, what's that, 70 years ago, 80 new countries and 750 million people have been granted freedom under self-determination. Aborigines are not among them. In 1974, the NACC was established by the Whitlam government. It was a national Aboriginal body that had no legislative power and no land. 40 years later, we've got the Aboriginal Congress. It's a national Aboriginal Islander voice. It's got no land and no legislative power.
It's a private company, isn't it?
Private company now.
There you go.
But in 40 years, Karen, what worries me is that those poor buggers in East Timor, who everybody ignored, 1 year after the NACC was established in 1974, they declared independence, and a year later, in 1976, Indonesian forces invaded them. And as we know, they controlled them. They kept up their fight, and in 2002, they got their country back. That was after a 26-year campaign. How far have we progressed in that 26 years? We haven't got anywhere. So, you know, we've got some tidbits. So this may not suit people, a treaty may not suit people, or one or the other might. But whatever it is, the only way we can achieve this stuff is everybody to sit down, think about how we get it, and campaign together. It almost answers Nala's question. Can you get this sort of stuff at the local level within Tasmania? No. Can you do it as part of a big national change? Yes, it's possible. Over to the audience.
Just with this, if we went with the 7-state option, we'd still fall under the Commonwealth, wouldn't we? They would still have that ultimate control. But
No.
They wouldn't.
No. Two reasons behind that. As I was saying, under Section 121, when they have the power to establish, they lose the power to unestablish it. They think, oh, we made a mistake, we set up an Aboriginal 7-state, we now want to limit it, they can't do it. Because the reason for that is that the Australian Constitution has 120-something provisions, and the High Court has said, when you look at the whole of the Constitution, it gives these enormous powers to the federal government, but those powers can't be exercised in a way that that challenges the existence of the states. So if the Commonwealth goes too far and says, well, we're going to take away the right of one of the states to raise taxes, the High Court say you can't do it, because without the ability to raise taxes, the state can't exist. And so, in other words, that's an example of the protection. Recognition are running to the Constitution to change it. We don't need to change anything in the Constitution that under this system doesn't already protect us. So that if we set up the 7th state and we had, say, customary law, and the Australian government said, oh, you know, we're getting bad press in the Sun Herald or the Australian, so we want to pass a law to say that customary law does not exist. We could whip them into the High Court and say, under the 7th state, there are some communities in Australia where customary law is essential to their existence. And it's almost certain the High Court would say, well, the federal government has got the power under race power, but if it passes that law, it will really knock around the chances of the 7th state existing. So we will declare it invalid. And the other thing in the Constitution, there's other specific provisions I haven't put up there that says, if the federal parliament is going to legislate in the states, it can only do it with all the states. It can't pick on any one state, and if it does, it's invalid. So the funny thing about it is the white man's constitution has never worked in our favour, but under this, we could use their provisions to give us all the protection that a treaty can't give us, native title can't give us, but under the seventh state, all of these other provisions, are about 20 of them, that we could use to protect what we've got. So that's the short answer to no, the federal government can't interfere.
That's a great answer, Nick, but what's the reality if the Parliament's going to turn around and develop a seventh state? And go, if you're saying, well look, once their power's been given, they're not going to be able to repeal it because that's the end of their powers, well they're obviously going to see this and turn around and say, as if we're going to give you the power to be able to run your business in the way in which you want to do so and have a bit of sovereignty over your own life. So they wouldn't do it.
Yep. Certainly not now.
No.
And the interesting thing is, have we ever asked them? One of the things, you know, they've got us by the short and curlies. We're too frightened to move. And, you know, our ideas are so narrow that, you know, they can just run around and do everything, invade Iraq or whatever. They don't have to worry about us. One of the other benefits of this is, if we are entitled to self-determination, which means Aboriginal people have an international right to decide whether we're part of Australia or not part of Australia. We are not entitled to that at the moment because we have no designated territory. So if we went to the United Nations and said, we want self-determination, they'd say, where's your territory? We don't have a working government. You've got to have a working government so that the working government can negotiate with the United Nations. We don't have that. And the third thing we don't have is a clear expression of the will of the people. You can say, well, Aboriginal people never ever voted for assimilation. Well, that's true. But where have Aboriginal people ever voted for self-determination? Like Scotland. The United Kingdom says, look, we'll pay for it. We'll pay for the referendum. But Australia won't do it. Now, if we had the territory designated, but not a seventh state, if we had set up a working government that the world could recognise as probably representative of Aboriginal people around the country, and we held our own referendum, because the Australian government wouldn't do it. We get money from overseas. We get all the money to hold a referendum. And if the people said, yeah, we want to be independent of Australia, then you're into a whole new ball game, because Australia no longer has the right to make the decision. Because the Canadian Supreme Court in 1998 said, people like Aborigines, they were talking about the French in Quebec, but what the judges meant was, people like Aborigines in Australia are entitled to self-determination because of what's happened to them. But the court said they're not allowed to exercise international self-determination, not allowed to set up a new country unless the country they're in refuses to give them internal self-determination. And the court said if they refuse to give them internal self-determination, then they can go for a breakaway. So all of a sudden you could see, when you say, why would the Australian government do it? Because it's in their interest to strike a deal with us. Because if you get the international community on side, like South Africa did, like East Timor did, you can see the power of the international community. The international community says, we're not coming in to help you because you haven't got the ingredients. You've got no territory, you've got no government, and you've got no clear expression of the people. But if you've got those things and the Australian government still knocks you back, come and see us. Because you can then sue them in the International Court of Justice and get a declaration that Australia is in breach of international law. It's a legal remedy. So that's just another possibility. And it's another, sort of weapon in our armour.
So it'd be better for us, or getting away from this though, but when you go back to the treaty, it'd be much better in our Aboriginal interest and Torres Strait Island interest to have a treaty at a national level, because otherwise it diminishes all our aspirations, sovereign rights and everything else by trying to deal with the local level, because it's quite small. If you try and deal with local government and local councils and everything else, it diminishes everything that we're trying to achieve. If you deal with it at a national level, you can try and have a lot more of these big issues addressed. Is that what you're saying when we go back to the treaty thing?
Well, it's certainly a debate. I mean, I'm giving my views, but, you know, if we had more and more community meetings, it'd be good to have someone come up with it. So, well, hang on, I've got a different view about that, so let's talk about it. See, what we're doing now, we had a momentum up in the 1990s that we lost, all these sort of discussions about the bigger picture. I remember Karen, Clyde, up in the Glebe, back in the 1970s, we all bought these little papers, and none of us knew what we were talking about, but we all come up with these things about whether communism could better than capitalism, and none of us knew what capitalism and communism was. You know, but we were thinking about this sort of stuff. And, you know, you've got to keep up the momentum, so you have a debate about it.
How come the lands that are handed back don't count as territories? Like, you know how you're saying that you've got the ingredients list that you need for the international community to step in order to lend support to the cause? Why is it that land that's been returned, or particularly land under where people are asserting native title, why is that not territory enough? Like, does it actually have to be a designated state, which is handed to you by the federal government? They say this is your territory.
No, it's just the step back. The first step would, can you get out, Matt? Hurry up, Sarah. Sarah's been very patient with me. The Aboriginal owners of those lands would have to say, we want this area of land to be included as part of Aboriginal self-determination, a seventh state or an independent state. They'd have to say that. If they did, and you had enough people agreeing to it, and the Australian government said, we're not going to allow you to be the seventh state, even though you had a referendum and you developed a working government, you know, it wouldn't have to be like the Parliament. It can be a representative body that all Aboriginal people think, oh, I don't agree with what they're doing there, but yeah, I support them being our representatives. And yes, we're happy for them to go off to New York and talk to, or go off to Africa and talk to all the black countries there about giving us support. If you had those in place, and then you go to Canberra and they say, no, we're not going to legislate. You wait for that to come out in writing or in the newspapers, and then you go over, send your delegates overseas and say they are refusing to give us internal self-determination. And then you'd say to one of those countries, will you on our behalf take our case to the International Court of Justice against Australia? And if they said yes, as far as legal theory is concerned, we could take the Australian government to the court, and the court could declare that we were entitled to external self-determination. And then the international community would take that judgment and put all sorts of pressure on Australia. Diplomatic, economic, could stop their people coming here, tourism, and so on.
But you need a consensus by the Aboriginal community Australia-wide that that's what they wanted for it to occur. Is that what you're saying?
It would have to be.
Now, my big problem with that is I reckon that a lot of people in this room, not everyone, but there'd be a lot of people in this room that would disagree with having that idea as the next step. But you're just saying that's why it takes such a period of time, because you need to get around and educate everyone, especially the next generation of people. And with the current government climate and the way in which it is, I reckon this should be shot down pretty quick at the moment.
It's not only local community.
No, straight
It's
forward.
also from state to state. You might have different Aboriginal groups coming out. We might have a state and suddenly you've got power struggles within that state because they have the much largest land components attached to it. But what about the example of what happened, was it in Alaska? Wasn't there a separate state set up there?
Yeah, the Inuit.
The Inuit, wasn't that in Scandinavia?
No,
It was the North.
Wasn't it in the Northwest Territories or something?
Yeah. They actually, the Alaskan government actually created
That's right.
a separate state.
Yeah. And that's exactly the model we're talking about here. And when I had a look at their legislation, because I was thinking to myself, well, what would the legislation look like? The Canadian legislation said, what do they call it? None of it. It said, the state of none of it is created. That's all it said. And there it is. And then suddenly they had the power over, I think, 1 million square kilometres of land. As big as all of that, or half as big as all of that.
The one thing with the map up there, Mike, I don't quite understand. If we, say, had a set of the state, I'm going to start to be quite self-interested. Because, like you said before, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, got bugger all there. So where's our power for equality within that Aboriginal state? What would we run the risk of being Tasmania like we are now, kept down as the poor cousin, without any say or any prospect of getting resources, e.g. money, into the state for us to further develop ourselves, because we all go to South Australia, Western Australia and the Northern Territory. I can see those as being really big issues that would force the 4 eastern states to really consider where we should.
I mean, that's exactly right, Rodney. And what those Aboriginal groups who've already got this land would say, look, we can't do it for you. If you fellas down in Tasmania want more rights, more land, including the 7th state, we can't come down and get it for you. The same as, we can't go up and get it in southeast Queensland. So it really has to happen at the local level where people campaign for more and more land.
No, I understand that. That's not really the point.
Right.
The point is where the seat of power will be and the seat of prosperity. It's like Western Australia are there now as a state, saying you arseholes back in Tasmania are sucking wooden houses. Now, would they do the same, but it'd only be black against black? That's what I'm thinking. It's not so much the land, but how the whole lot of the Aboriginal state, if you like, can be treated equally, and we would need to be, because we don't currently have the resources to be able to operate independently as someone else without money.
Yeah.
There'd also be issues with a lot of families in these northern states, families that have leased out their land or let big business and company use their land for huge royalties that go directly to 1 or 2 members of the family that's meant to be distributed to the community, but have a lot of say over their local community, and turn around and say, no, we're on a good thing here, look at us, we're looking after you, and they'll have the big influence over vast majorities of their communities, and they'll turn around and say no too.
A couple of things. They are the debates that we get the drift of as we got closer and closer to it, but we need to be conscious of it. One of the examples is, supposing we run a really good campaign leading up to 7 and we get this land back here. Remember we had that meeting at the Elders where we talked about 7 million coming from the wood chip industry and 5 million from the federal government under that loggers settlement. $12 million a year was going to go to us, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. If we got this land back here and all those black greenies or green blackies, whichever way you want to look at it, said, look, we've got to raise our own money somehow, and the state government will have no power to collect royalties off that land. So all the wood chip royalties would come to us, or logging. We might say we don't want it, no logging, whatever. But if it did, and then somewhere here they found gold, and it was worth billions, and up on the mainland there, these other Aboriginal communities said, well, we're all part of this one Aboriginal state, so we want our share of that. What would the Aboriginal community here say?
Don't find your own freedom on.
But we can't complain if they say something to us.
That's right. And I know that
But there is this debate, and this is the things that, it's not just up in the cloud stuff, it's real hard decision stuff where you discuss it and you try to work out the answers to some of these tricky questions.
I've got a question, Nick, just quickly. So you were looking at physical boundaries there. So say, for example, the Commonwealth Government has said, yes, we're interested. They put in the physical boundaries at the time. What would happen later on down the track? So if you're talking about all the land that's been returned and everybody around the country agrees to the seventh state, what happens in the event of future land? Because you may have the boundaries defined of that state.
Yep, it might expand, say.
Okay.
Some Aboriginal group, say one state government held out and refused to give any land back to the local Aboriginal people. We couldn't convince the federal government to buy it for them or whatever. Then 10 years down the track, a new government gets in and says, we will agree to this land. The way it works, Constitution again, hurry up, sorry. This is the mechanics of it, Karen. I'm not sure this answers your question. The state would then surrender that part of the state to the Commonwealth. They couldn't hand it over to the seventh state.
No, I don't think you get my question. Okay, we've all agreed, that all the blackfellas around the country have agreed that we want the lands that we currently own, whether it's native title, land rights, whatever, that are going to go into the seventh state.
Yep.
And so the Commonwealth, I assume, at the time of doing it, would they be putting in physical boundary locations as to the defined seventh state?
Do you mean post them that?
Yeah. No.
What do you mean by physical?
Well, you're going to have a bit of land in this state, a bit of land in that state. Yeah. So then what would happen afterwards if, for example, some further land was gotten, that would then become part of the seventh state as well?
If the...
Could new boundaries be inserted? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, it can change. The Aboriginal group who got the land back 10 years after the seventh state was set up would have to agree that they wanted their land as part of it.
Yep.
Then they'd have to lobby the state parliament to say, we want this land to go into the seventh state. The state would have to pass legislation.
Yeah.
And they would hand it over to the Commonwealth. You'd have to trust to then say, we will pass a new law to say this new land is now part of the seventh state.
Yeah, that's what
So
I'm
that's
asking.
got to be done with every bit of future land.
Yeah.
Got to go through that process. And the...
But who would it go through, Michael, in the sense that, like, the way that I read that, Clydesdale will disappear, which will be part of the seventh state. So then who does the state government hand back that bit of land? And what authority then does our representatives of the seventh state have over land that's coming into the Tasmanian Aboriginal community?
The elected assembly.
All that would have to, that would be a huge administrative
Can you
nightmare.
straighten that forward, please, Sam? Let's deal with what we've got now. We know that the land we've got back is, forget all this here. We've got little pencil dots here, but we've got that and a couple of islands. Supposing Hunters was going to come back, yes, you'd still have your local organisation, your local community campaigning for it, because we're all still living in the cities, and we're all doing what we do now, except we can, under this new arrangement that's already in place, we can now all, Rodney can stand for the seventh state assembly, and we can vote for him. And so you might have 2 or 3 go, I don't know how many you'd have. So we're participating politically, but we're still living where we are. Then the state government says, well, this is still part of the Tasmanian land. We haven't surrendered it to the seventh state, but we'll give it back to the Aboriginal community. So it could go to the land council, and then the land council would need to hold a community meeting to say, should this land just stay here under Aboriginal land rights, or should it be part of the seventh state? If the community says, yeah, we want it to be part of the seventh state, then you go back to the state government and say, amend the legislation, or, I mean, this could all be set up at the same time as they said, look, we're going to hand hunters back to you,
Here.
and you'd say, well, if you're going to do, you know, the West Coast landscape, you'd say, well, look, at the time you amend the Aboriginal Lands Act to hand that back to us, we've already had community meetings to say that land is no longer Crown land, it's now Aboriginal title. Section 2, this land is now surrendered to the Commonwealth with the consent of the Aboriginal Land Council on behalf of Aboriginal people of Tasmania. That's what the legislation would say. Canberra would get it and say, we'll pass legislation now that the land known as Hunter Island is now part of the 7th state. That's the mechanics of it. So you've still got to have your local organisations.
I'm not getting any more land.
Well, that's what I was going to say, we couldn't get any more because the government would say, well, you've got the 7th state, that's it, to put no more. But what I was going to say is that I actually think I mean, this has been good discussion, but there's a lot coming out of it, people are running out of time. Maybe we need to plan some further workshops and people can come along and actually bring their own ideas and thoughts about what could be, whether in the negative, positive, what problems they might see, so that it keeps going on instead of us probably walking away and 3 years later, nobody's done anything or thought anything more about it.
Well, the Land Council holds regularly community meetings.
We will
And the centre regularly holds community meetings.
do that.
I'm being sarcastic.
How are you?
Do we want to have a 5-minute break? What time we finish at 3:30?
Yeah.